everyone, to Hamilton, the musical, the man, the story. This is an event created by Financial Narrative. And Financial Narrative is a community of the world's leading financial marketers and storytellers. And it's a great best practices, educate our teams, and grow professionally. We bring together the most forward-looking leaders from within banks, asset wealth managers, capital markets participants, as well as fintechs. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Stephen Tisdalle. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of State Street Global Advisors. We're the third largest asset manager in the world, and depending on what day it is, our assets are hovering around $3 trillion in assets under management. Many people know me for a campaign that my team and I led called the Fearless Girl Campaign, and that was a campaign to help raise awareness around the globe of the power and potential of women. I don't know, we have all the fun and glory of working remotely, as many of you know. I'm here today with two unbelievably well-known Hamilton scholars, Professor Richard Sylla, and David Cowen. I'm going to introduce them briefly. They have amazing credentials and backgrounds that I think many of you are going to be interested to hear from in today's discussion. Professor Richard Sylla is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the Stern School of Business at NYU, where from 1990 to 2015, he was the Henry Kaufman Professor of History of Financial Institutions and Markets. Professor Sylla is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's a fellow of the Cliometric Society, a fellow of the Economic History Association, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His research is really focused on the financial history of the United States in comparative context. He's the author, many of you will probably be familiar with this, of Alexander Hamilton, the Illustrated Biography, as well as the American Capital Markets from 1846 to 1914. He co-authored Alexander Hamilton on Finance, Credit, and Debt in 2018, The Evolution of the American Economy, and A History of Interest Rates. We are really, really fortunate to have him with us today. He was instrumental in providing advice to Lin Manuel on the musical, as well as Professor Cowen, Dr. David Cowen, whom I'm about to introduce with you now. Dr. David Cowen is the president and CEO of the Museum of American Finance. He has over 20 years experience as a trader. David Cowen is the founder of Kazar Capital Partners, a macro hedge fund. He holds his BA in American History from Columbia College, his MBA from the Wharton School of Business, and as well as his Master of Arts and PhD in American History from NYU. He's written extensively on US financial history and is the co-author of Alexander Hamilton on Finance, Credit, and Debt, as well as The Financial Founding Fathers, the Men Who Made America Rich. He is a founding co-chair of the International Federation of Finance Museums and has served on the Smithsonian Affiliates Advisory Council, as well as the Federal Reserve Board's Centennial Advisory Council. So I'm delighted to have both Richard and David here today. And in our conversation, we're going to cover some of the question about Hamilton's influence on finance and capital markets. And then we'll move on to his rather sensational life. I'm not sure why on my end I'm going in and out, but hopefully we've teed up the first question about who Alexander Hamilton is and why we're still talking about someone who died over 200 years ago. So why don't we start with you, Richard, and then we'll have David weigh in.
I actually thought maybe, Dick, let me do the easy part first. Would that be okay?
Sure, let David go first.
And thank you, Stephen, for that wonderful introduction. Let me just add a couple things to the bios that you should know. One, with full disclosure, is I was Dick's student when I took my PhD, so I always like to get that out early. I am the pupil, he is the teacher. And then secondly, there's always something fun to tell about Dick with respect to Alexander Hamilton. Dick is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, class of 2012, and guess what? So is Alexander Hamilton, although class of 1791. With respect to that question, let me do the easy part. The short part, the why part, is pretty clear. It's because of Lin Manuel Miranda. I mean, we have a museum whereby the patron saint's Alexander Hamilton, and Dick and I would give tours of the museum before the show, and very few people had actually heard of him. And by the time the show hit overnight sensation, we would give tours and 7-year-olds would be finishing our sentences. So the why is easy, but Dick, how about the who?
Well, I think what we should know about Hamilton, Lin Manuel Miranda called him the $10 founding father, and we see his picture on the $10 bill, and he was a founding father, one of the big 6 founding fathers. I think historians by consensus think that the 6 greatest, most influential founding fathers were, in order of their birth, Benjamin Franklin, then George Washington, then John Adams, then Thomas Jefferson, then James Madison, and finally Alexander Hamilton was the youngest of the big 6. And I think the reason why Hamilton is, back in our sites today, besides the musical, is that we're realizing that Hamilton equipped the United States with a lot of modern technology, especially in finance. And not only that, I think we're going to talk about that soon, but I would say, as a biographer of Hamilton, that he's a person that was involved in and played a key role in almost every important event that took place between 1775 and 1800, when the United States was first declared its independence and then fought for it, and then created the Constitution. And Hamilton then was Secretary of the Treasury, the first one from 1789 to 1795, and he even finished up as being Major General Hamilton, Inspector General of the Army, which would be something like Army Chief of Staff today, between 1798 and 1800, when there was a war threatened with France. The war didn't take place, so that's why we forget that Alexander Hamilton was a Major General. But so, he just was there and did things. I think we're probably coming to finance now. Well, I'll pick up on that. The Hamilton was wondering in the late stages of the American Revolution around 1780 and 1781 why the Americans on their home turf were having so much trouble with the British. And what he concluded was that the British were doing so well because they were well financed and the Americans weren't. And so Hamilton studied financial history. He learned about the Italian city-states. He learned about the Dutch Republic. He learned about Britain itself, its rise in the world. And he concluded, as a soldier in the army around 1780 and 1781, that finance was more important even than winning battles if you wanted to prevail in the long run. And for about 10 years, he formulated a financial plan. And, 10 years later, he was the first Secretary of the Treasury. And what he realized was the modern financial system has several key components. The public finances and debt management. The government itself has to have a good credit. It has to be able to manage its debt. He noticed that the Dutch and the British had a central bank. The Bank of England was Britain's central bank. The U.S. needed a central bank. The U.S. needed a stable currency, which Hamilton dealt with in his Mint report in 1791. And so Hamilton could do things as Secretary of the Treasury about public finance and debt management and about founding a central bank and about creating the dollar currency. But I think he was clever enough to say if he did a good job doing those things he could do directly, other people would complete the system, and other people and institutions were state governments. So state governments, after Hamilton, began to charter more and more banks. Hamilton created a lot of national debt securities and stock in the central bank. It was a mostly private corporation. And with all those good bonds and stocks, people began to trade them. Probably people, to clinch that point, let me just note that the New York Stock Exchange was founded in 1792 under the buttonwood tree in Wall Street. And one of the reasons for it was there were so many good securities, new securities to trade. And then finally, Hamilton's Bank of the United States was a gigantic corporation. David wrote his PhD thesis with me about that. And I think it set an example for the state governments to charter more and more corporations, both financial corporations like insurance companies and also non-financial corporations like manufacturing companies, transportation companies. So Hamilton basically realized the key ingredient of modern economic development, and he reasoned that if a country had strong finances, its government would be strong and its economy would grow. Hamilton said that as early as 1781, and what he did was install a modern financial system in the United States, and we've had this modern financial technology ever since that time. And just to conclude, and so we can move on, nobody would have guessed it, but 100 years later, the little U.S. economy of the 1790s was the biggest economy in the world. By the early 20th century, it had the largest banking system in the world by far. A lot of people don't know that before World War I, the banking system in the United States had more deposits and assets than the combined banking systems of the next three biggest countries, Britain, France, and Germany. We also had our big financial markets. And that all started with Hamilton. So I think, in the U.S. economy grew and the U.S. government became strong, and that's what Hamilton worked for, and basically he achieved it.
There's a big tussle about whether we should add another 2 to 3 trillion in light of the pandemic that's hit not just us, but around the world. What would he say about the amount of debt that we have today?
So I'll take a first try at that. And Alexander Hamilton, let's just set the stage a little. He created our national debt. There's a direct line from the bonds that he created of what was called assumption, which we should honor our debts, and $26.5 trillion worth of our national debt today. And there's a quote from then, he said, a national debt, if it is not excessive, will be a national blessing and the powerful cement of the Union. By the way, his detractors over time take away from that if is not excessive and just tie Hamilton to the national debt. And quite candidly, I think he would think it is very excessive at this point. And particularly Hamilton created vehicles like what's called a sinking fund, so that whenever you put debt on, you found a way to pay for it. And so that's what a sinking fund was all about back then. So my impression is Hamilton would not be happy at the levels of the national debt right now. Dick, what do you think about that?
Well, I just to follow up on that, I think Hamilton would be glad that we're able to take on this debt and have people buy it. I mean, that shows what a good credit we have, but in some ways we might be abusing it. And Hamilton tried to prevent the abuse of the privilege of being able to sell your bonds easily to domestic and foreign investors. Hamilton basically reiterated several times in his public career that the key to making the debt immortal was that whenever Congress, say, increased the debt, it should at the same time, dedicate some maybe increased revenues to pay the interest on the debt, plus a little bit more, that little bit more eventually would allow you to reduce and maybe even retire the debt. And so a principle of Hamiltonian finance is that when the government borrows, it ought to take some measures at the same time to pay the interest on this new borrowing, and also to bring in a little extra ultimately to reduce that debt. And that's a principle of Hamiltonian finance. One instance in which it was followed was when New York built the Erie Canal. They thought it would take a long time for the canal to pay for itself, so they increased an auction tax in New York City, and they increased the salt tax on upstate New York in order to pay the interest on these Erie Canal bonds in the early years. And so that's an example of Hamiltonian finance. When you borrow, you make sure you have a way of paying it. And I think the problem I see in our current debt management is that we just borrow and borrow because we have a good credit, and we don't pay attention to the important point of thinking down the road, how are we actually going to service this debt and maybe even reduce it or pay it back sometime.
What would Hamilton have to say? We got a lot of people, a lot of audience members that are from outside the United States that are members of Financial Narrative, pardon me. And, how have Hamilton's ideas influenced finance in other countries? You mentioned a little bit in your introduction to the first question, but it might be good to just weigh in on how he's really impacted the financial system globally that we have today.
Well, I think he had an influence on the world that most people don't realize it. He had a lot of disciples in his own time and in the years after he unfortunately died at an early age. People like the Carey family in Philadelphia and John Marshall, of course, the Supreme Court Justice, they carried on Hamilton's traditions after he was died. And basically these Americans sort of, thought that Hamilton had installed good finances and we ought to maintain them. Then a German named Friedrich List came to America in the 1820s, and he was in Philadelphia, and he absorbed a lot of Hamilton's teaching through the people in Philadelphia. He went back to Germany and wrote a book called The National System of Political Economy, which called for Germany to protect itself a little bit in a world where British dominated, and also build up its financial system. And his book then helped Germany develop. And 70 years later, when the Japanese were trying to develop a modern economy, they went to visit Germany, and Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, handed them Friedrich List's book and said, "This is how you develop an economy." Well, basically, he was telling the Japanese to follow Hamiltonian principles. The Russians learned the same lesson, and they began to develop in the late 19th, early 20th century. And, those same principles of Hamilton come down to us in our own time, especially in East Asia, where Korea and South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore and other East Asian countries basically adopted a Hamiltonian stance on improving finances and stabilizing their governments, and they had good luck. I would say the main difference between Hamilton and some views is that Hamilton was thought the government should sort of partner with the private sector in developing the economy and making the government strong. And, there's a view in America that the government is sort of the root of all evil, and we should let the markets do everything. Right. That isn't the way that Korea and Taiwan and Singapore developed. I mean, the government worked very hand in hand with business, stabilized the financial system, and they developed very much. So, the U.S. was probably the most successful emerging market of the last 2 or 2.5 centuries, and some of the ones that followed the Hamiltonian principles that made us the most successful emerging market, these were countries that followed the Hamilton path. They were not, the government is evil. They wanted the government to work with them.
I was going to say, Steve, if I could just jump in for a sec, we have prepared 2 charts that explain Hamiltonian finance, what it was in this country before he came and what happened after. And if we could just put up the 1788 chart. So this is a year before Hamilton will take the oath of office, September 11, 1789, to become the Secretary of the Treasury. But our national public finances were effectively bankrupt as a nation. Our securities are trading at junk bond prices. There's no active securities market. You go to a coffee house and maybe get a price or two, but nothing active. There's no central regulating monetary authority like the central bank. Just a few corporations. We don't even have our own money. We're using foreign coins at this time, Spanish pieces of 8, and all 3 banks in the nation. And by the time Hamilton leaves on the next slide in 1795, what has happened, if we could pull that, thank you, we have a thriving national public securities. We've got a bond at 3%, 6%, and deferred. We've got a very active organized securities market in multiple cities, not just New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston, Baltimore. We've got a central bank at this point that's got 5 branches on its way to 8. We've got at least 100 corporations, a convertible US dollar tied to gold and silver, and at least 20 banks in the nation. And so this is a Federalist financial revolution, a Hamiltonian revolution. He's got to get several critical reports through Congress to untangle this debt, and as well as to create the central bank. But he does all this, and many people on Wall Street have no idea how the capital markets were created. They take it for granted they've always been here. Well, someone had to create it, and here's the creation.
Do we have, just on that point, did you say we have some questions from the audience? Because we are open to fielding some questions. Oh, I'm just going. So on that point, what would, if Hamilton were alive today and we're advising not just the US government, but we're in a global pandemic, what would he be saying we should be doing right now? If you were taking his principles and knowing everything you know about him and his financial philosophies, what would he be, how would he be tackling this situation right now?
Well, I would say that Hamilton, controversially in our political system, Hamilton believed in a strong federal government. And not everyone in America believes in a strong federal government. But Hamilton was the exponent of that. And I think he would say that a pandemic, once you understand what it is, requires sort of a national solution, not a regional or local solutions, because the virus doesn't know any state borders. It doesn't know any city limits. And therefore, if you have a strong central government, it really ought to take charge of organizing the solution to this pandemic. And he would probably not be terribly impressed by the way we've done that in the US. But he did favor strong federal solutions, and that's part of the reason he became controversial. Jefferson and Madison became his political enemies in the 1790s because they were states' rights people. I think Hamilton would have realized that the pandemic is a national problem and ought to have national solutions, that you shouldn't just sort of kick it back to the states and localities to solve the problem, because, as we found out, people move from state to state. New York can do all it can, but, the people are going to leave New York and carry it elsewhere. And if those other elsewheres don't have national direction, the problem's likely to spread. And that seems to be what happened.
Would there be anything that he would be saying now, saying the course that we're on, and not just the US, but once again, the global financial system, would we be in danger of anything if we keep going on the way we are?
Well, I think David mentioned that Hamilton said a national debt, provided it is not excessive, could be a national blessing. And I think Hamilton would view some of what we're doing today as a bit excessive, that we're running up debts and, hoping beyond perhaps a good reason that everything will work out all right. We probably ought to be a little more careful in the way we accumulate debt, because if those debts can't be paid back, we'll have bankruptcies and financial problems. We had a crisis 10 years ago based on excessive creation of not so good debt, and it could happen again.
Right. I'd suggest also, Hamilton was very much against the mob and rioting and all sorts of problems. And in fact, in 1794 was part of the troops that went to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. And so he was very much in that sense law and order. And I don't think he would look favorably as to some of the unrest in the streets.
Interesting. It's very hard to separate the impact of financial policies from political policies, and we're seeing that playing out right now, particularly in an election year. What would he be advocating right now, and how would he be scolding? Let me just clarify the question. What would he be lecturing us right now on? And if he was observing the political situation, a lot of decisions, financial decisions, are being made on political grounds. What would he be saying about that?
Well, hopefully he wouldn't be asking for a duel.
Yeah.
I think
we'll get into the salacial aspects of his life in a minute. But how would he be advising the current both parties? What would he be saying to them right now?
I think he would be in favor of, responsible national solutions to our political problems. As David mentioned, he believed in ordered liberty, that if you have law and order, that's a key ingredient of liberty and being free. And if law and order breaks down, you have a problem. So Hamilton would not be so happy about the unrest we're having in some of our cities now, but he would be equally worried about the throwing money, if you think about it, we haven't really heard very much about how the government is going to deal with all the money that's been created and all the debt that's been created in this crisis. I think Hamilton would want us to talk a little bit more about down the road, how do we handle this situation once we get through the virus crisis, and what sort of measures are we going to take to deal with our bloated national debt? And something I worry about, I mean, there's been a lot of money creation, double digit, 20 to 30% year-over-year growth in money. In the past, that's led to inflation in the United States. Hamilton would be a little bit worried about that, I think, because he wanted to have a stable dollar. And what we're seeing now is, some questions are being raised about the stability of the dollar. So these were, I think Hamilton would like to see our leaders talking about this a little more and debating it and coming up with solutions. And right now, we don't see much of that.
Right. David, did you have anything you wanted to add to?
Real quick, he was always very concerned about the credit of the United States, having lived through the war and the terrible credit of that Continental Congress. The credit to him was imperative. We're still, a AAA credit, but he would be watching that, always concerned about to make sure that we stayed that way. Look, within 15 years of Hamiltonian finance and getting us on a great level, we borrowed 11 and a quarter of the $15 million to buy Louisiana. So as long as our credit was maintained, he would be happy. But if he saw that start to slip, he would be very unhappy.
Well, let's move on to his personal life. And I think what's amazing is that 200 years later, we're talking about a person who had, as we've discussed for the last half an hour, a massive impact in terms of, the financial system, not just that we have in the United States, but globally. Let's talk a little bit about his life. He was brought to life in Hamilton, the musical, that Lin Manuel, crafted, if you will, in an amazing, relevant way to popular culture. Can you tell us a little bit about why you?
I think what Steve was going to ask was the simple question of, tell us a little bit more about his life. We've spent a lot of time talking about the policies and what the policies mean globally, what they mean historically, but let's learn a little bit more about Hamilton, the person.
Thank you, Eric. Sorry about this. I don't know why it's going in and out, but we're moving along.
Well, I'll pick up on that. I mean, what's interesting about Hamilton, it comes out very much in the musical, is that of those big six founding fathers, he was the only one who was an immigrant from outside the country. He was born and raised on an island in the islands in the Caribbean. He was born on the island of Nevis, and he spent his youth on the island of St. Croix. These are now like independent countries. I guess St. Croix is a part of the U.S. Virgin Islands now. Nevis is St. Kitts and Nevis is a separate country. But he grew up in these sugar-producing colonies where most of the people around him were black slaves, African slaves that came to those colonies. So he grew up in that sort of society, and he developed a kind of strong distaste for slavery. Of the founding fathers, he was one of the strongest, maybe the strongest in his not liking slavery. He came to the U.S. as a teenager and enrolled in Columbia University, but by the time he was a sophomore or junior, the revolution was breaking out. And while still a teenager, he wrote Revolutionary War pamphlets. And then he organized an artillery company, and New York State made him a captain of the artillery. And so he fought in the major battles of Long Island and Trenton and Princeton. And by that time, his abilities came to the attention of George Washington, who invited Hamilton to become his right-hand man for the rest of the American Revolution. So that was a key development in our history, that the partnership between Hamilton and George Washington goes right back to the year 1777, when Hamilton joined Washington's staff. And the two men worked together in many ways while Washington still lived. One of the last things Washington did was respond to Hamilton's plans for a military academy. And this was in 1799, and Washington liked Hamilton's plan. And of course, a few years later, we got our West Point Military Academy. But that's, I think, one of the reasons people should think well of Hamilton is that George Washington thought well of him throughout his entire career. And Hamilton went on then from the Army to play this key role in like founding the Bank of New York and the Annapolis Convention, which led to the Federal Convention. Hamilton was a delegate to the Federal Convention. And then he was a key man in getting the Constitution ratified by organizing the Federalist Papers. And so, you know, he just had this event-filled life, and he seemed to dedicate himself. You know, he never made much money himself. He didn't seem to care that much about money. He wanted to go down in history as the founder of a great country. And I think that's one of, you know, we think our country is pretty great for all its problems. And Hamilton sort of dedicated himself to, you know, laying the basis for what we think of as a pretty great country.
You know, having just to add a little flavor to that, and you know, Dick and I have both read so much of his works. I mean, and as we like to say, Hamilton could not hold his ink. But the story that Dick saw Joe Ellis, you know, famous historian Joseph Ellis, say that if you took all those founders and took a look at their SATs, and you've got some luminaries there, Franklin, you know, Madison, Jefferson, deep thinkers, that Hamilton's SATs would be the highest. And I always like that, and it's true. His brilliance comes through his writings. It's incredible.
Right. For our foreign listeners, we should say the SAT is the test that many American students take before they go to college to separate out who's really good and who's not so good. And Hamilton, if he had the highest SATs of any of the founding fathers, all of whom were pretty smart fellows, that says a lot about his intellectual capacity.
David, you have firsthand experience working with the creator of the musical, Lin Manuel Miranda. We know that Lin Manuel came to the Museum of American Finance. What was it like to work with him and see this kind of come to fruition?
So he did come to the museum multiple times, and even brought Leslie Odom to the museum. They filmed a part of Hamilton's America, which is the making of the documentary. The last 10 or 15 minutes take place at the museum. I'm fortunate to have been involved in that filming with them. And he was really great. We went to lunch, you know, we had a lot of fun. He's very electric, lights up a room. I'll share a couple anecdotes, but one amazing time was he brought a mixtape, and then I brought the staff in, and he started to rap along to some of the songs as he was fact checking, which was pretty cool. Now, I must say, when he came, we had no idea, or I certainly didn't, of what was about to happen. You know, he said he was making a hip hop musical about Alexander Hamilton. And, you know, I was like, okay. And, you know, was happy to just assist where I could, but no clue what was about to happen.
David, do you have a slide that shows that?
Yeah, I'm going to show. Sure. Thanks, Dick. Here's one slide. I'll tell a few anecdotes of Lin. He's in my office. And we have replicas. These are not the real pistols, but we have replicas. Actual replicas were made, and that's actually a portrait of Hamilton behind my desk, and the Hamilton bobblehead, by the way, on the lower left, because we've had several Hamilton exhibits at the museum, and Lin did post this, but again, still no idea what was about to happen. And then, you know, a couple of stories. One is Leslie and Lin were in my office. We were right where that is. We were looking at what's called the Report on Public Credit. This is Hamilton's report to Congress to untangle the leftover debt from the Revolutionary War. And we were talking about the dinner party that was at Jefferson's residence. And Lin turned to Leslie and said, "The room where it happened." And I had no idea what he was saying. I said, "You mean Jefferson's residence?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, you know, there's a plaque. That residence is a couple of hundred yards from here." And they both looked at each other and said, "We got to go see this." So, you know, we brought them over. It's at 57 Maiden Lane. It's across from where the New York Federal Reserve stands today. And as usual, a couple people were outside the New York office building doing what they always do, which is smoking. And it was pretty amazing. And I didn't really put the connection together until some weeks later or so when Dick, and I'll talk about, we went to the public theater. Dick got us tickets. And all of a sudden, there's a rap about the song "The Room Where It Happened," and I put all that connectivity together.
So I'm back there on that point. This is fascinating. In light of that, like, you didn't know how it would all come together. So when you both actually went and saw the musical for the first time, were there any moments where you stood back and you go, you know what? There's a few liberties being taken here. It didn't quite happen that way. Are there any areas that, because a lot of us have either seen the musical, I've been privileged to see it a couple times in person, but now it's, of course, It's on Disney. It's available to the whole world. But can you shed some light on things where it's like, well, there might be a few liberties being taken here?
You know, I'll do the first crack at it, Dick. Maybe you've got a couple as well. But first, Lin did an amazing job. I mean, whatever we're going to say, these are minor given what Hollywood usually does. And I will tell you, when we were at the Public, I turned to Dick after like the first or second song, and we were there very early, and said, this is a great way to teach history. This is amazing. A couple of them in the duel, for instance, that happens between Charles Lee and John Lawrence. It is true that Hamilton was the second, but Aaron Burr was not the second for Charles Lee. But again, he's looking for ways to get Aaron Burr involved. For instance, when he's confronted Hamilton over the Reynolds affair, and they put in the show, they put Madison and Jefferson and Burr in the room. Well, that wasn't the case in reality. It was the Speaker of the House, Muhlenberg, as well as future President James Monroe, and one other Virginian. And so, again, these are smaller ones. They're the phrase tomcat. I don't know if you remember that from the show.
Yeah.
And that's something that's a myth that's been passed on from generation to generation. It's not true. A very famous scholar named Mike Newton has done some work. You can Google that on the tomcat, and it goes back to some satire that was written and that was placed in there, and then historians mistakenly picked up on it. The only thing I'd say that is an omission, and there's many other smaller things that I'm not at all fussed or worried about, and it's okay. The play had to end at some stage, but the duel, the last igniter to the duel, is in 1804. Burr comes up to New York. He's no longer going to be on the ticket, runs for governor of New York. He's not going to get that position. He's going to lose, and then some things are going to transpire where there was a doctor at a dinner party where Hamilton was saying some bad things about Burr, and that gets into the newspapers, and he said that Burr, the doctor says that Hamilton said Burr was a dangerous man, and then even something more despicable. And that's what sets off the chain of event of the letters. But the show was going on enough, so he just cut it off after 1800. That led to the duel. But again, this is small potatoes in the bigger picture of this amazing show.
Yeah, I would say what you see in the show is there's a little bit of poetic license, but you know, things weren't quite the way they're portrayed. But these are not material. I would say what I noticed more was that some important topics, like the one we discussed today, there's not a whole lot about Hamilton's financial innovations and reforms in the musical, and I think that's because, you know, finance can be a little complicated for a lot of people, so that was left out. And the other thing was there's very little about slavery. Slavery was a big issue at that time. And I heard Lin Miranda talking about that on the radio once, and he said, you know, I did a section on slavery and we had it in the show, but when we looked at it, it just didn't quite fit, so we took it out. He tried to do something, but I would say that what I missed more was there wasn't more about finance and there wasn't more about slavery in the show.
Stephen, I was going to just jump in and tell one more story about Lin when he was at the museum. And so, again, no idea what's about to, you know, hit this revolution. We have a gala every January or February. In this case, it was about a week before the show was to open. We were honoring David Rubenstein. We have a picture of that we can show. And we asked Lin, I asked him to come. Would he, you know, rap before the show, before the gala? And it was not easy because they were dress rehearsals for the public, but he was kind enough to do it and come. And I have to tell you, it was a bit of an icy reception for a lot of people. A cappella, he did the song My Shot in front of 400 or 500 people. And some people were into it, but other people were just not paying attention or talking over it. And in fact, a woman came up to me after and basically said, what was that? What were you doing? And I'm like, come on, you know, and I said, okay. Right. And 2 weeks later, that same woman asked me for tickets. It just goes to show you, you know, it was such an amazing, so you asked a little earlier, I mean, the impact was staggering. I mean, particularly, let's say to someone like Dick, who's been studying Hamilton his whole life, and now all of a sudden, you know, and when Jefferson's up in the history, Hamilton's down, and Hamilton's been down for a while, and now like a rocket shot, Hamilton is up.
Standing here, but I want to know, maybe both of you can respond to this. There's the whole salacious side of his life, and as you said, both of you said the musical really focuses more on that and less about his policies. and interpreting how his policies would be applied today. But are there any other little pieces of information that would be really interesting that we should know about Alexander Hamilton that are not covered in the musical, that really should be brought to bear, that give us a better appreciation of this individual?
Well, I would say that this not covered in the musical is Washington's farewell address, which is one of those documents of American history. It's not quite at the same level with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but it's considered a major document of American history. George Washington's farewell address as president in 1796. And what many people don't know is that Alexander Hamilton basically drafted this address for George Washington. And the funny story is that 1797, Hamilton is now a lawyer in New York City, and he's walking down the street with Mrs. Hamilton, and a bookseller jumps up and says, I have this thing which you should read. And it turns out it's a copy of the farewell address. And Hamilton pulls some coins out of his pocket and gives it to the guy, and then he and Mrs. Hamilton continue down the sidewalk, and then Hamilton looks at his wife and says, "That man has sold me my own work." And so that's a kind of anecdote. Many people don't realize that Hamilton really wrote most of George Washington's farewell address. That's a kind of anecdote that didn't make it into the musical. There's some other biographies you can read that Albert Gallatin, who was of course Jefferson's Treasury Secretary and very much of a Republican anti-federalist politician in the 1790s, Jefferson really had a strong antipathy to Hamilton. And when Jefferson was elected president in 1801, one of the first things he did was tell Gallatin, his Treasury Secretary, to go through the records of the U.S. Treasury and dig up dirt on Hamilton. And Gallatin later told Hamilton's son, since I had opposed your father in many ways, I went at this task with considerable gusto. But what I found out was that there was no dirt to be found, and Hamilton's system was more or less perfect, and all the rest of us would have to do would be to run it from then on. And the punchline of the story is that Gallatin tells this to Thomas Jefferson, and he says, Mr. Jefferson seemed to be highly disappointed.
Do you think, it sounds like not a lot's changed. Politics was pretty dirty back then, and we're seeing, of course, at times it's almost embarrassing, the state we've got to. Are things that different today than they were back then? We don't have duels today, thank God. But, how different is the political environment today than it would be then?
Well, we talk a lot about divisions in our politics today and as being very strong, but they were equally strong in the 1790s. Toward the end of the 1790s, when this war with France was threatened, we passed a couple of laws which are sort of infamous in American history, the Alien and Sedition Acts. And these were laws that said, you couldn't criticize President Adams, or, you might be put in jail, or if you were an immigrant, we could deport you. And so, we haven't passed any laws quite like that now, but the divisions were, as great in the 1790s as they are today, which, is maybe a little bit of cold comfort for people living today, that the U.S. has been through these periods before where there are major political divisions.
Yeah, to pick up on that, think about it. Jefferson is in the administration and finances a newspaper that attacks the administration. This is, and, it's in the show, but it really was vicious how the Virginians and others came after Hamilton. And in fact, it's not covered in the show, but Hamilton is brought up on charges. It's called the Giles Resolution, after a representative from Virginia. And so in response, Hamilton, they want to know where every penny is spent. He creates a 90-page document balancing the budget to the penny. And I actually have one image of this large, what I call Excel 0.1, because he put together a 2.5-foot long spreadsheet that's 2.5 feet long. This is the revenue side, by the way, and all the tariffs that's the tax on imports that are coming into the nation. And it's just incredible, the viciousness back then, but then his response. By the way, the tariff, since we're on it, Hamilton was clever enough. People think, oh, we just wanted a high tariff to raise revenue, again, the main source of income. That's not true. He wanted just the right amount, not to choke off the revenue, but just enough so that he could operate and not hurt trade and commerce.
Interesting. Well, this has been a fantastic opportunity to just hear a lot of the insights that both of you bring to bear. Are there any discussions at all with Lin Manuel about doing a sequel? And if you were going to write, if you will, what the sequel would be, how would you approach it?
Boy, that's a tough one for a retired professor to come up with. I don't know. I mean, I think, you could do, something similar perhaps with Jefferson, or, that wouldn't be that could be a sequel to the Hamilton show. I mean, the Jefferson is a major character in the Act 2 of the show. He's not there in Act 1 because he was off in France being our ambassador to France from 1785 to 1790 when he came back to be the first Secretary of State. But there's enough interesting stuff about the back and forth between Jefferson and Hamilton in the show now that I almost think a sequel could, do a similar sort of show for Jefferson, but I don't think Lin is going to do that now. I mean, his life was changed by this show, and he probably has some different ideas.
So I'm going to go into the fantasy world. Hamilton kills Burr and becomes president in 1808. And then we don't have the second, the War of 1812. Lin did say it was basically a one and done. But because I just have one more anecdote, that's a funny one. That reminded me of that, which is a young girl, 7 years old, came to the museum and was looking at all our Hamilton artifacts. And then we have some Burr artifacts in the Hamilton room. And she wrote me a letter, and her dad, by the way, said, excuse her, she's 7 years old. He put that in saying, why in the world did you put Burr artifacts in the Hamilton room? Burr killed my hero. And so I wrote her back and I said, listen, we can't change the narrative. He killed my hero too, but here's the point. We have a bobblehead from the store. Please take that. That will hopefully comfort you.
Well, thank you. That's, in closing, we were going to open it up for questions, but I know we've had some challenges just in terms of some of the tech that's occurring. But I wanted to at least, unless there's some more items that you guys would like to share, start to bring this to a close. Are there any closing other additional points that either Richard or David you would like to include?
Well, I'll bring up one point. Hamilton became big in the recent years because of the musical, but in my view, he should have been big, and with many historians, he was big. So why was he sort of under a cloud for much of the 20th century? And I think one of the reasons is that, our historians tend to be a little more on the left than on the right, and Hamilton represented economic growth and the rise of big business and manufacturing, and somehow or other, a lot of our historians think that business has too much power, finance has too much power, and so the historians were a little bit biased against Hamilton, and that's why we're sort of surprised now that when we learn more about Hamilton in the 21st century, we didn't really know more about his great achievements in the 20th century. Jefferson seemed to be a little more popular in the 20th century because he was for the little guy. Well, in fact, I think I thought it was one of the great paradoxes of our historiography that Hamilton, who's this penniless immigrant coming in from the West Indies, is considered to be an elitist, big business type, and Jefferson, who has a plantation with 200 slaves, is considered a great man of the people. But in fact, that's what's been done. I'm trying to figure out, I'm doing some writing right now, trying to figure out why this came along. And the best I can come up with is that Jefferson seems to be anti-business and Hamilton was pro-business and Hamilton was pro-big government, so he was a bad guy. I think that's something that interests me as a historian. We need to be more fair to Hamilton, I think. He's gotten a bad shake from historians.
And I would just add a thank you to Lin, because Hamilton was probably going to be taken off the $10 bill until the show, and he intervened. He actually wrote me after he had met the Secretary of the Treasury saying, we're going to be happy, because a lot of us, like Dick, myself, and others, were very upset when we heard that that was going to happen. So,
Right.
So to that, but it's very interesting that we don't have a Hamilton memorial really in this country. There's certainly statues to Hamilton, and there's one in Central Park, but there's no overall national memorial. Jefferson certainly has one, Lincoln, others. And I wonder the long-term impact of this show, and if one day Mr. Hamilton will get his memorial.
It wouldn't surprise me. And given now how much people understand about Alexander Hamilton because of this new medium, I mean, we're all in the communications business. Everybody that's part of the financial narrative group here, we're in the business of communications, and perhaps we could close with this. Lin Manuel, as being a historian, he's actually used a medium that has never been really used before, at least in a contemporary way like this. What do you think about this medium, about using musicals to tell and talk about our history?
I think that's one of the greatest things about it, is that, you know, a lot of kids who didn't pay much attention to early U.S. history or U.S. history in general, you know, got really interested in the history. And that was a wonderful thing that Lin Manuel did, because, you know, David and I and lots of other people think history is very important, including financial history. And our museum tries to, you know, show us our wonderful financial history with, you know, not with warts and all.
Yeah.
But I think that, you know, the great thing about what Lin did is get a whole bunch of, you know, young people in America interested in our really interesting history, which, you know, they hadn't been so interested in that before this show. So that was a great achievement.
But it sounds like this, you know, has really, this medium has started, and you were starting to talk about, really taken effect, being able to appeal and be relevant, if you will, to younger generations versus classic conventional textbook type of learning. I want to really thank both you, Richard, and David for sharing so much about Alexander Hamilton in this discussion. And I particularly want to thank our audience for being part of this event. We will be giving copies of Richard Sylla's Alexander Hamilton, the Illustrated Biography, to 30 randomly selected members of the audience. It's a book that you'll find extremely informative, and it's just really beautiful, actually, to thumb through. I have a copy of it, and it's fantastic. If you win a copy, the Financial Narrative team will email it to you. To check the Financial Narrative website for upcoming events, and reach out to the Financial Narrative team if you're interested in becoming a member. I think this is a great organization to be part of. It covers a lot of really relevant topics, and it's been a privilege to do this today. So thank you, everyone. Absolutely. The American Museum of Finance is something that when the pandemic is over, or when we start to loosen things up, we should all be heading down there. I know I want to take my two boys down there as soon as we can.
And you can go to the website now.
That's true. We can access a lot of this information over the internet. So thanks to that.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks a lot.
Take care. Bye-bye.